Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome into a new episode of Capital View, a weekly webcast brought to you by the Daily Journal and djournal.com, talking about what's going on with the Mississippi legislature. I'm your host, Brad Locke, joined as always by Capitol Bureau Chief Bobby Harrison. Bobby, how you doing? I know you had a busy weekend down there, didn't you?
That's right, Brad. We worked all weekend. Tried to watch a little basketball game while I was working, but I wasn't able to watch too much. But they're wrapping up this week, and so they met this whole weekend.
Yeah, trying to get that state budget agreement hammered out. They had the deadline Saturday night was the deadline to do that, and they got something worked out, Bobby. But as Greg Snowden, the pro tem, said, it's mighty ugly. So, Bobby,
Yeah,
what are some of the highlights there of the budget agreement?
yeah. That was probably a moment of candor by the House pro tem Greg Snowden, Republican Meridian, when he said it was mighty ugly. What else you want me to say about it, or something to those effects? Yeah. And the Senate Appropriations Chair Buck Clark, in a moment of candor, conceded that when I asked if it was going to result in layoffs of state employees or elimination of programs, he said yes. So it's, but most every agency, with the exception of one, got cuts. Some of the cuts for a lot of agencies were double-digit percentage-wise in terms of what they were appropriated during the 2016 session compared to this session. So it's a bleak outlook for a lot of state agencies going into a new fiscal year that begins on July 1st.
Yeah, you just look at some of the numbers here, like the institutions of higher learning. We get about 586 million this year. We got 660 million this past year. Talking about the coming up fiscal year compared to the current one that's almost done. You got Department of Health down from 65 million to 57 and a half. Department of Mental Health down from 241 to 226. And this, Bobby, comes right on the heels of another round of budget cuts for this fiscal year, the fourth round, I believe, for this fiscal year, and like the sixth in the last 18 months. Is that right?
Yeah. Just to try not to get too deep into weeds, what happens is that the legislature appropriates for the right now. The legislature is appropriating for the next fiscal year, which begins on July 1st.
Right.
If there's a revenue shortfall, if revenue does not meet projections during the fiscal year, it's usually up to the governor to make cuts, and he's made cuts 4 times during this fiscal year, 170 million total, and in addition to that, he's dipped into the rainy day fund to take an additional $50 million so he wouldn't have to make even deeper cuts. So it's just, if you look at, you were comparing what was appropriated in 2016 to what's being appropriated even as we speak right now.
Right.
As the legislature works to complete the budget proposal that was agreed to Saturday. But if you go back to the 2015 session, and what was appropriated then, that was more in the 2015 session. What was appropriated more than what was appropriated during 2016, and what's going to be appropriated this year is a lot less than what was appropriated in 2016. The budget for this year is going to be about $330 million less than what was appropriated in 2016, and in addition to that, in 2015 there was about $30 million more appropriated than in 2016. So it's a rough trend right now for state revenue. And because state revenues are down, a lot of agencies all agencies are being cut. People have already been laid off, programs eliminated, and more will be for the coming budget year starting July 1st.
And I know Governor Bryant said he was hoping to minimize the impact on education. I think that they gave the Mississippi Adequate Education Program a 1% cut, correct?
It was cut about $40 million. It's going to get about $40 million less than it got last year. I believe that's the number. You may have it there in front of you.
Oh, I've got it somewhere, Bobby. I've just got all these papers. I can't find
it. a lot of papers going around.
But it's 1%.
Yeah. K through 12 got less of a cut than most agencies got. That's absolutely true.
Okay. Yeah. But still, Bobby, I mean, after all this, this is not surprising, I guess. We've seen it going this direction, especially with the revenue collections. I mean, what's the general mood down there? Obviously, a lot of Democrats not happy with the way things were going, and they're looking ahead now to this other big tax cut, the $415 million tax cut, I think, over a 10-year span that they think could make things even worse.
Yeah, they're saying, thus far, there's been about $325 million taken out of the state general fund through tax cuts passed in the past 4 or 5 years. And of course, as you mentioned, the big one that was passed in 2016, but it doesn't go into its impact will not be felt until the upcoming budget year. And for the first year of that $415 million tax cut, the impact is going to be about $20 million, which is not a lot, but that $20 million could be spread out and help a lot of agencies. And a lot of Democrats are saying that tax cut should be postponed. And not even some Republicans, Becky Curry, a Republican House member from Brookhaven, who happens to be head of the conservative coalition, she came out this weekend advocating that the tax cut be postponed. So that was pretty amazing. But the leadership says it's not going to happen. They stand by the tax cut. It was a tax cut for businesses and on personal income, and they say that the tax cut in any one year will not take more revenue out of the state general fund than there will be growth in revenue. Of course, that may not be true because revenue hadn't been growing in recent years. So I don't see how they can reach that conclusion, but that's their hope at least.
So what's the rest of the day going to be like, Bobby? I know they've got a midnight deadline tonight to get this proposal passed through the legislature.
Right, to finish the budget. That they have until midnight tonight. They're working through the bills right now. They're having to recommit some bills, but the numbers, they're recommitting the bills to just deal with language and specific items in appropriations bills, but the numbers are not going to change. The numbers we've been talking about, it's going to be about $330 million less appropriated during the 2017 session than was appropriated during the 2016 session, and there's just not the Democrats are trying to block the passage of some of these bills, but they don't have the votes to do that.
With politics comes a lot of spin, Bobby, on both sides of the aisle. Obviously, I'm curious how. And you mentioned a couple of Republican lawmakers that are admitting, this is not pretty. But how much can this be spun? How much are they trying to spin this? Speaking in particular of the House leadership, leadership and Governor Bryant, Lieutenant Governor Ted Reeves, the gun. How much can they spin this? I know they use the term efficient and responsible government spending, but I mean, it seems like it would be kind of hard to spin positive.
Well, I think if you have I don't have it there in front of me. I think you have my story there from today's paper.
Yeah.
Speaker Philip Gunn said, this is what we were elected to do. The Republican majority was elected to do is cut taxes. Yeah. Cut taxes and reduce government spending. So they say, from that aspect, they say they're doing what they were elected to do.
Good point. And one thing that a lot of people were hoping was that there'd be some funding for for transportation needs, infrastructure. Looks like we're not going to get a bond bill passed here, are we?
No. There was a effort, to pass a bond bill that, they generally pass a bond bill every year. At the end of the session, they reach an agreement on this same weekend where they reached the agreement on the budget. But Saturday night, they didn't reach an agreement on a bond bill that would have provided money for transportation improvements and would have also provided money for building projects on the university campuses and some state building projects.
Right.
And they did not reach an agreement. Speaker Gunn and Lieutenant Governor Tate Reeves, who presides over the Senate, were at odds, loggerheads on the bond bill. I think the House wanted to spend a little bit more than the Senate wanted to spend. And the big sticking point was that the House wanted money from the collection of internet sales tax to go to a transportation improvement program.
Right.
And Lieutenant Governor wouldn't agree to that. So, as a result, there's not going to be any additional money for other than the normal appropriation that that they get each year. There's not going to be any money for transportation improvements, and there won't be any money for building needs on the university campuses and on the community college campuses.
Bobby, I know we've only got a few days left in this session. When does it wrap up again? Is it early next week? Is that right?
Well, I know it's this week. The scheduled final day is Sunday, but it could be as early as Wednesday or Thursday, just depending on what they end up fighting about during the final few days.
Yeah, and what might we see them fighting about these last few days, Bobby?
Well, there's still some budget issues out there that could really mess things up if they don't get those resolved before midnight tonight.
Yeah.
And then you have a bill that would take away some of the power of these boards, these occupational licensing boards, to take power away from them and give it to regulate these agencies, whether it's accountants or chiropractors or acupuncturists or cosmetologists. It would take the power away from the boards to kind of regulate them and give it to a 3-member board consisting of the governor, Secretary of State, and Attorney General. That's still out there. There's some stuff there's not any big stuff still out there. There's not going to be any rewrite of the MAEP funding formula this session.
Right.
Doesn't appear that there will be a special session, which some people have said there'd be a special session within the session, but doesn't appear that's going to happen either. So there's a few bills out there, but there's not many major items left other than dealing with the budget.
Okay, let's wrap up the program with the 3 things that Bobby from this past week that you noticed: the most impactful legislator, most impactful piece of legislation, and the strangest thing to happen there at the state capitol. Let's start with the most impactful legislator.
Well, we could probably, in some shape, form, or fashion, talk about Steve Holland every week.
Yeah.
But he was sometimes for funny reasons, sometimes for not so funny reasons. But last week, as I'm sure all the listeners know, he went to the well of the House chamber to announce in a very moving and literate speech, just very well crafted speech, that he is suffering from dementia, and I would say he did this in the early stages, and on most days, just about every day, you can't. He doesn't seem any different than he's seemed for the 20 years or so that I've known him. But he says that that could change rather suddenly. He hopes to finish out the term, he said, but that was a monumental moment, a moving moment in the House chamber. He as he spoke, there was complete silence. The speaker made sure that everyone was the speaker knew what he was going to say, but no one else did. So the speaker made sure everyone was in their seat and silent, which doesn't happen very often in the House chamber. And everyone was really listening, and there was not any movement. And it was a very moving moment on the House floor.
Yeah, and his term, of course, would expire in 2019. That's when the next round of elections is. So,
right. He'd already said he wasn't seeking another term. Steve Holland's been in that House since 1984. Has been a colorful member. He's known for his colorful oratory and
yes.
Sometimes off-color language, and sometimes some people, even he would say, sometimes he goes too far in making a point and has offended people more than but he's always been always been man enough to apologize when he did go too far, or he felt he went too far. So even though he's can be controversial, I think he's probably one of the most liked members and one of the most respected members of the Mississippi House of Representatives.
And of course, most people know he's a funeral home director. And I liked his quote. He said, "I've been an undertaker. As an undertaker in Mississippi, I've stared death in the face for 40 years. I'm not afraid of the end game." So, best wishes and prayers to Steve and his family. Let's talk about the most impactful piece of legislation from the past week, Bobby.
Well, it's probably the legislation that died, the bond bill. I mean, that's gonna be have a big impact on the state's transportation system, as well as the community colleges and universities. They're already being cut in money they're getting, and now they're not going to get any money for building projects. So that's a major impact. We usually talk about legislation that's advancing, but this week, let's talk about some legislation that died as being very impactful.
Indeed. And finally, the strangest occurrence from this past week in the state capitol.
Well, I'm going to kind of cheat, Brad, and I'm going to go to the strangest occurrence, and it's something that just happened just a few minutes ago. As we talked about, the legislature passing the budget bills that was agreed to Saturday night, and the House is just, because the Senate would not agree to their effort to pass a bond bill and include some internet sales tax revenue for transportation. The House has just recommitted the transportation budget bill, and the reason they said they did that is that it had some PEC projects in there for some legislators that would take the limited amount of money that's already available for transportation would take that money away from just doing general needed road work and send it to take care of projects for particular legislators. So the House voted almost unanimously to recommit that bill to take those pet projects out. And what was so funny was it was a leadership. Usually leadership is saying, we can't recommit these bills because their agreement has been worked out, and we need to honor that agreement and pass the budget and get out of here. But it was the leadership leading the effort to recommit the bill, so you don't see that very often.
All right, good stuff as always, Bobby, and thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Capitol View. Again, coming to you every Monday around 2 p.m. live at djournal.com. If you miss it, just catch the replay later in the day. You can follow Bobby on Twitter at BobbyHarrison9, and he'll be back next week. I'll be back with him to discuss, wrapping up this legislative session that, as he said, could end within just could end this week, actually, no later than Sunday. So until then, thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next week.